Jeremy Ryan Slate. All right, we're live, man.
Hey, thanks for hanging out today, man.
It's my pleasure, and thanks for coming. You were just telling me before we were about to go live that you were a power lifter in, would you say, in college?
So in like I didn't do it like with my school. I went to Seton Hall here in New Jersey. But I just did it for fun. Like all through my teenage years, I was a wrestler in school. So after high school, I was doing competitive powerlifting. Through my teenage years, my early 20s, and I'm not a big guy. Like I'm 5'6", 5'7", 5'7" on a good day, and I was weighing in at 215 at 8% body fat. So like.
How did you do that?
So I have a naturally fast metabolism. I'm like like an ecto mesomorph. So like, I'm kind of between those two body types. So I'd have to eat around 6,500 calories a day. Like it was nuts in order to keep weight on. And I was doing anywhere from 1.5 to 2 grams of protein per pound of body weight.
1.5 to 2. So what, that was what, 100 and 200 grams of protein? No, that's like 200 to 300 grams
It
of
was like
protein.
350 to like 400 grams of
Holy
protein.
shit. What were you eating specifically?
I was doing a lot of, so I kind of later in, the last couple of years, I've gotten more into whole food sources, but I was doing a lot more like, weight gainer shakes, adding, waxy maize for extra carbohydrates to things. I was doing a lot. So I've had chickens for years. So I've done a lot of raw eggs, stuff like that. So whatever I can do for protein. And I was also eating every hour and a half to 2 hours in order to like get that much food in.
Were you doing steroids or like legal, any of that stuff?
No, so I didn't do any steroids. I did have a friend that did, and he was 5'3" and he was like 240, which was nuts. But like I did a lot of things that were legal at that point in time that aren't now. They're called like pro hormones. So they would like, you could get them at GNC, any places like that, and it would help to like boost testosterone and stuff like that. So that was, it was definitely something that helped. But those were banned pretty quickly by the FDA, and you couldn't really get them, for very long. So I had tried that type of stuff, but I was already at my heaviest by the time I was, trying different supplements at GNC and stuff.
So the reason it came up is because you have a show after this one around 2:00 where you're going to go a couple hours, and it's like, what is that show going to be?
It's called It's called Learn True Health. And I think it's over on like her YouTube channel and stuff like that. But just going to be talking about, fitness, a lot about, because I've been in this podcast world for like almost 15 years now at this point too. So just about that, about media and all that fun stuff too.
To do reference, you're like a specialist in like Roman history, I think, in Catholicism, particularly
Yeah,
like ancient religions and stuff.
Yeah, so my undergrad degree, I was a double major, and I was like, I don't recommend anybody like do college like I did. I was like, hey, that course looks really interesting. Let me take it. So I got to my first semester, my senior year, and my advisor's like, so I know you're majoring in Catholicism, but if you take this one extra course, you can major in world religions too. So I was a double major in Catholic theology and world religions, and then I was like 2 courses short of doing a triple major in history, because at Seton Hall they had this sliding scale where if you paid one price, you could take 18 credits or you could take 12 credits and it was the same price. So I just took 18 credits every semester. And then in grad school, I got my master's in the Roman Empire, and I just focused a lot on that.
Why? How come you got into religion to begin with?
I went to Catholic school all through grammar school, high school, college. So it's just always been something interesting to me. I've always been somebody that's been a seeker in a lot of ways.
Did it change you and like your beliefs studying it in school so intensively?
Yes and no, because you look at some things, especially like in the Middle Ages, and like it's changed how we look at a lot of things now. But like in the Middle Ages, a lot of things were done for the power of the papacy. So you look at kind of what happened to the Cathars in the Albigensian Crusade in the 1300s, and you look at some of the early reason that priests couldn't marry was because what was happening was they were willing church property and things like that to their families. So it became a problem because there wouldn't be any church property in order to like continue the church. So yeah, sure, there's certain things, but at the same time, I think you look at what the main reason we're doing this here, and I think I look at the spiritual aspects of it. But yeah, there are certain things you look at, you're like, well, that doesn't make sense. But you look at other things, and it makes you believe more, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, it does. Like the Cathars, they were a heresy. I mean, a Catholic heresy, I guess you would say.
Yeah, so the Cathars, it's, by the way, if you have, I haven't been there, but I really want to go. We actually just got back from Paris, but I want to go to southern France. Southern France is where the Cathars were. It was called a couple different names for it, but it was called Occitania. And they had these people there called the Cathars, and they had this interesting mix of Christian religion but also worship of the god Apollo. So, that didn't exactly jive with what, the papacy wanted in that time period. But they're really interesting because they had this mix of French, Spanish, and Latin, and their language was called Occitan. And they had it also like they'd reached a lot of like there was a lot of equality between the sexes. There was a lot of different races, even races and religions and things like that getting along. So it was a really interesting like time and space. But one of the issues was there was kind of these warring warlords in the region. There's Carcassonne, which is in this area. There's Narbonne, which is in this area. So those warlords going against each other, and eventually, I think the Pope puts his power behind Raymond V, and that kind of jazz all pops off.
He
There's
was
a
not
really great book about it if you get a chance to read it. It's called Ermengarde of Narbonne and the World of the Troubadours. It's a really dense, really long book, but it's really interesting if you want to get perspective on like that whole world.
on the Cathar and the Occitanians.
Yeah, because also like so Ermengarde, which is funny, like I don't know if you've ever seen those memes that are like Ermengarde. It's spelled exactly the same way. Ermengarde was a woman, and she basically never gets married because um, she's not a count, she's a countess, so she's able to control this whole area. And she knows if she ever gets married, she loses her power, right, to whatever man she marries at that point in time. So she takes her entire career pretending to like date men and get engaged and do all these different things, and she manages to stay in power her entire life because she kind of just leads all these guys on. It is
Oh,
really interesting look into that world.
whoa. That so Ermengarde was a female warlord.
Not a warlord, like a noble. She was like the countess.
And she kept being like, I'm almost gonna get married. I'm almost there. It's just maybe next time, guys. Maybe
Yeah,
next
so her
time.
whole life she does that, and she lives a pretty long amount of time, and she manages to stay in power her whole life. Because what would happen is if she married, well, then the man she married would become the count, right? So if she would lose a lot of her control, so to just kind of lead people on, let her control the area.
Was she French?
She would be French, yeah, but
Okay.
it's in that interesting area where there's a lot of Spanish influence, there's a lot of French influence, and then there's also kind of a lot of like they had been Roman territory, so a lot of Roman influence too.
Was that like northern Spain? Like was that the Pyrenees Mountains? I'm not sure. There's a
It's
mountain.
actually exactly on that border there.
There's like Navarro and all this. I get a
Mhm.
lot of my references from this game called Crusader Kings 2. I don't know if you're much of a
Oh,
gamer. Have you played? It's
dude, I have this 15-year-old PlayStation Portable that I play Madden 14 on. That's about
oh,
it.
Madden was high. I used to play Madden 3. Was it? I don't know. Madden 96. Madden 93 is when I got into Madden.
All the players in that game retired 10 years ago.
Boom, he's on his back. That was they used John Madden vocal clips. But Crusader Kings 2 was nice. I probably put 1,200 hours into this game, this freaking game, and I play as the Venetians, patriarchy, and then you'd see the power of the Pope, and I would realize just by playing a video game like
Mhm.
that the Pope's not always your buddy. Like sometimes, there's a lot of struggle between the papal authority and people going free investiture and saying, what is that exactly? Free investiture? Are you familiar with?
I'm not familiar with that
Okay.
word now.
Well, in the game, it's when you say screw the Pope, we're gonna
Okay.
take control of our government, and then the Pope gets pissed off, but what is he gonna do? And he can excommunicate you, and
Well, I think
sometimes
like
some
part of the
jerk ass
issue
Pope.
Yeah,
Oh,
part of the issue with that, and this is actually something that's inherited from Rome, is there's not really a separation of spiritual and temporal power. And, now it's not really that case, right? Like the Pope isn't really a political figure. But at that point in time, like, the Pope was deciding, who was king, who's excommunicated, whatever. So like there's a lot more like temporal power, right? Power of this world in a spiritual figure.
could the Pope actually declare war?
He had his own army, but he would have to get kings to declare war for him, right? Like there's the Papal Guard, which this is another interesting character that we can talk about in a second. But a guy like Cesare Borgia, who's the son of Pope Alexander VI, is the guy leading the Papal Guard in that point in time, and he actually uses his power to conquer most of Italy before he dies.
The Pope's son? So
Yeah, so he was the one of the only so Cesare Borgia is the once again he's thought to be the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI. Alexander VI is the guy that in 1492 takes America and divides it between Portugal and Spain. So he's that pope. And he has this son. And a lot of times what would happen is rich families could buy their way into like religious power because the religious power and political power are very similar. So you had the Medicis doing this, and you had families like that doing this. The Borgias were a very rich Spanish family. So Rodrigo Borgia, or Alexander VI, is a very powerful guy from Spain. He basically gives his illegitimate son Cesare a cardinalship, and he's a cardinal for quite a bit, but eventually he denounces cardinal, and he's one of very few people to ever do that. I think there's like 2 or 3 people to ever like denounce being a cardinal. And after that, he becomes a condottiere, which is like an Italian warlord. And what he does is he organizes these different armies. Like first, he uses the French army under forget which king it is. I know Louis is the one that takes over for him. Anyway, that king is the one that dies by like hitting his head.
Oh, when he like he's on a horse and he rams into that something and it kills him.
Yeah, it kills him. It's I forget the name of the it escapes me. Like there's so many historical names, man. I feel like often I blank on them. But anyway, so he takes the French army first, then he takes these other armies and he starts conquering the little Italian states. And that's what Cesare Borgia does. And the interesting thing about him is if you've ever read The Prince by Machiavelli, Machiavelli, the guy he's alive at the same time as Borgia, and they knew each other. So he says that Cesare Borgia was the perfect prince by the definition of Machiavelli, but the thing he wasn't planning for was his own death. And he gets sick and dies suddenly. He likely had syphilis and wore a mask in the later part of his life because he had like stuff on his face from syphilis. And he suffered very badly with malaria. There was a malaria plague going on at this point in time. So he gets very sick and close to death with malaria, and he loses a lot of his territories. And basically, other guys kill him at that point in time because he wasn't prepared for being sick.
So they say he was the perfect prince because he was a great conqueror and a great administrator. But then as soon as he disappeared, the entire thing fell apart.
Correct. It's very similar to Alexander, right? Like Alexander was the guy keeping his empire together. And then when he gets on his deathbed, maybe he was poisoned, maybe he got sick. We don't really know. He names these guys the Diadokoi, or the successors of Alexander. They say, well, who will continue your empire is the question they ask him. And he says, to the strongest. So then they all just fight each other for a few hundred years to decide who's in control of different territories.
Do you think that Alexander the Great was poisoned by his men?
My opinion is that he was, because they all wanted to control these different areas.
Yeah, I kind of thought that he was too.
I was obsessed with Alexander the Great in school. That's what got me into Rome.
Really? Dude, so how far back have you studied? Like when did your expertise really begin?
It's interesting because it's like I know a lot here and there, if that makes sense. I know a lot about the life of Alexander. I know a little bit about the Hellenistic age after that. Then I know quite a bit about Rome, more about the early Republic or the late Republic and the early Empire. So it's like I kind of know how everything works and everything works together, but I kind of have these pockets of where I know the most, if that makes sense.
You go way back to Romulus and Remus?
So Romulus and Remus, like when you look at the 7 traditional kings of Rome, so the first one's Romulus, the last one is Tarquin the Proud, or Tarquin Superbus. And we don't know if kings of Rome really even existed, but there's traditionally 7 of them. And what the Romans used kings to do was to explain different things in their government they didn't understand. Like, oh, why do we do this? Oh, we do it because Tarquin the Proud said it. Or we do this because, Lucius Pernus said it. Or we do this because of Romulus said it. So Romulus may or may not have existed. But if he did, it's thought that the she-wolf that raised him and his brother is likely just a prostitute. The she-wolf was a nice way of saying it. There's, next to the Palatine Hill in Rome, there's a palace, which is thought, it's the remains of a palace, which is thought to be the palace of Romulus. But once again, we don't know if these kings of Rome were ever actually real.
Oh, they don't even know if Romulus and Remus in the story was ever real, or if they just made it up.
Because the Romans didn't have a written constitution. They just had what's called the mos maiorum, or the ways of the ancestors. And it's like, well, we've always done it this way, so we do it this way, right? And if you look at Greek democracy and the Roman Republic, the Greeks like to say that they had democracy first, and they say we had it in 508, right? But then the Romans are like, well, we had a republic first because we had it in 509. So often a lot of these different things go into trying to explain like how we got here, right? Like for all we know, we actually don't even know what year the Republic started. It's just that they want to say we had it first.
Yeah, I've heard of this theory that Charlemagne the Great is actually just fabricated by the Catholic Church in the year 700 and something, and they were like, by the way, it's the year 1000, and this great man Charlemagne unified all of France. He's the first Holy Roman Emperor. Trust us. and now it's the year
I don't
1000.
know about that, because when Charlemagne, I think he dies around the year 800. But like if you look at it, like there is a line of kings that go from him, and there is historical evidence that the kings around him existed. Now we don't know if he had as great of the impact, right? Because often in history we embellish if it's the victorious people that write it. But historically, there's a lot of things that do say Charlemagne existed.
Yeah, and I've heard this theory, and I was like, wow, that's a
If you
weird,
want to look at
interesting.
somebody like Edward the First from England, Edward the First, he claimed to find the body of oh gosh, King Arthur, right? And we know that King Arthur likely didn't exist. It was just a story. But he claimed to find King Arthur's body, and then creates a whole veneration to King Arthur because it gave people perceived power of him, right? Like, oh, if he has King Arthur and he found King Arthur, this guy's powerful.
Speaking of, do you think that the Shroud of Turin is real?
Um, there's been a lot of research on that, and it doesn't seem like it's old enough to be real. But I haven't looked really in depth into the shroud.
Okay, those are some cool tangents, but I really want to ask you about.
Sorry, man.
No, I'm the one
I
doing
have
it.
ADHD, so I go down some
Perfect.
rabbit holes.
I've been taking Alpha Brain. Do you ever eat this stuff? Shout out to Joe Rogan, Aubrey Marcus, and now I guess Unilever, who owns the company. But it's a great nootropic, and I've
Oh
noticed
wow.
taking it. My memory is like super clear and spot on and like sharp. So, how far back in the Roman history does it become factual, where they can be like, it is now legitimately documented that these people were real?
I don't have an exact date of that, interestingly, because if you look at a lot of Roman history, a lot of Roman history was written in the late first century BC and the early first century AD, right? So like right around that year zero time point. So, and a lot of that was history that was paid for by Emperor Augustus. So a lot of what we know about Rome, unless it was the writings of Cicero or people like that, because Cicero was kind of a late Republic character. I would say we know the most about the late Republic, and then the late Republic being like 133 on, so like after the Carthaginian Wars, that was kind of where we know the most. Um, and a lot of the, like I said, a lot of the history was paid for during Augustus because he wants to create this. Well, we've always done it this way, right? Like, so he wants people to kind of look at him as like kind of how things have always been.
Do you think, I mean, of course it's subjective as hell, but do you think that he was full of shit? That he was just like, let's just create the most beautiful history story to get all these people on board? Or did he do his best to really make an honest interpretation of oral history?
So you have to look at it too, like he's a powerful guy. And if you're writing about a powerful guy that has the power of life and death over you, kind of things you're going to say about him? You're probably going to say really nice things. So absolutely, I think a lot of it's embellished. If you even look at the Trojan horse that we talk about in the Iliad, isn't in the Iliad. A lot that actually comes from Roman history, because the Romans were tying themselves to the Trojans through a work written called the Aeneid during the reign of Augustus. So they tied themselves to this character named Aeneas, who is a guy that carries his father on his back out of Troy, and it's his family line that leads to Romulus and Remus, and then helps starts the founding of Rome. So even the Trojan horse actually isn't in the Iliad. It's in the Aeneid.
Yeah, I was reading the New Testament. I just started reading Matthew. I've read
Okay.
six chapters of Matthew, and the first book of Matthew is like a book of names. I don't know if it's chapter 1. I think it's just a bunch of names. Like there's 42 generations from what's his name, the first Abraham, all the way down to Joseph, Jesus's father, Joseph. And it's like from Abraham to, I think, King David is 14 generations. From David until the Babylonians come and take him as slaves is 14 generations, and from there to Joseph is 14 generations. But I'm like, what? How could anyone verify this stuff? Because anyone could have written that and been like, yeah, Joseph's descended from Abraham. Like, how convenient.
Well, I think part of it too is you have to understand, like, once again, this goes back to who's writing it, right? Like the reason that we history is often written is people want to prove a point, right? You look at some of the things that are written now, which honestly really pissed me off, Ian, about saying like Trump is Caesar, and it's like, no, you're an idiot. You're just trying to prove a point. And I think like you have to look at who's writing history. Like we say the fall of the Western Roman Empire was 476, but it was likely just because Justinian, who's the Eastern Roman Empire emperor, has this idea that he wants to reunite the East and West Empire. So he starts this Reconquista where he's going to conquer Rome and bring it back into the empire. Well, his conquest of Rome is what destroys what's left of it. Well, if he doesn't want to look like an idiot, his scribes are going to say Justinian fought off the warlords and freed them from the barbarians and freed the Roman people, and the city was destroyed by the barbarians. It was likely destroyed by Justinian saying, "I'm going to put it back together."
Oh man, I heard that when the Allies were like conquering Germany during World War II, that they bombed all these roads and supply lines. That they didn't know that the Jews had been held in concentration camps, but they just bombed all the German supply lines, so the Germans couldn't get any more food into the concentration camps, and they started to starve. Like,
I haven't heard that. That's wild.
It's a terrifying concept, but I mean, it's like, yeah, you go, that's the horror of war, and the fog of war is when you start blowing stuff up, everyone's going to suffer, even the captives. So like when you study history and the Romans history, how much of a grain of salt do you take with the writings as you're reading it?
Well, once again, you have to understand like who wrote it and why they wrote it and what their purpose in writing it is for. And I think that's really important because it's going to tell you a lot about it. But I think as well, I'm somebody that I always want to look at primary sources. So I don't often like other people's opinions of history. I'm going to read as many primary sources as I can. Like, I'm going to read Tacitus. I'm going to read Livy. I'm going to read Polybius. I'm going to read these different guys so I can kind of learn what they had to write about. But you have to understand, like, Polybius was a Greek that was a paid tutor of a Roman family. So of course he's going to make the Romans look better. So you just have to understand, like, sure, you want to get a picture of history, but you want to look at like who wrote it, and I guess what kind of viewpoint are they going to have on what they're writing.
I guess then this takes me to the Bible, which did an X Space a couple days ago that you were on for. You spoke for about 5 minutes or something, 8-10 minutes, something like that. And this is one that's like, it starts to tug at heartstrings of people that have really, I guess, integrated the story of the Bible as reality without question. But like, okay, who wrote that thing? Why was it written? Where did it come from? So in your studies of the Romans, because I feel like the Romans I feel like they very likely wrote that thing as like propaganda, or at least utilized a lot of aspects of it as propaganda or twisted pieces of it. But I mean, there's just no way to verify. And I'm a skeptic by nature.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the case because you have to look at like early Christianity, like isn't very well organized, right? Like there are lots of different sects in it. And they all have their own different beliefs. And so there's lots of different books that were written. And there's the Council of Nicaea is where they basically look at like two different like viewpoints on religion, one being Arianism and the other being what we know as orthodoxy. So once again, at that point in time, you don't really have temporal power being power of the world and spiritual power being a separate thing. So the Roman Emperor Constantine at that point does call for this meeting, and they take a look at, well, what is our viewpoint on this? So that is looked at. Now, here's the thing I'll say is he's calling the meeting because it created political problems in Rome, because you had these different groups saying like, well, we're going to, because political power and temporal power aren't separated. Now, I don't think he's exactly telling them what to believe, but he is the one that calls the council, right? So the people that are in the council that were Christian thinkers would have come to the thoughts on it. He's looking at it more for, if these groups are splintering, what is this going to do to my empire? I think that's where it comes down to. I think for him, it was less of, I'm going to tell you all what to believe. I don't really think it's that, because once again, like if you're telling people what to believe, they're not going to really have buy-in into it. People have to actually believe something, right? I think that is important. So I think he's calling a council because he says, okay, these groups aren't getting along and we need to figure something out here, guys, because I'm not going to have my empire fall apart like that Western Empire did, right?
So, oh yeah. So like that was like the beginning of the organization of the religion, when they say organized religion.
Yeah, because Constantine, the battle of, so you have this kind of feud between who's in charge when Constantine becomes emperor, between him and I think it was Maximinus, who was one of the previous guys in charge at that point in time, and he's fighting against Maximinus, and he has his army fighting against him, and there's this battle called Milvian Bridge, and that's in 312 AD, and he has this vision. And he sees the Cairo, the Greek symbol, and it says, under this you will conquer, right? So he has them all put the Cairo on their shield, and they win this battle of Milvian Bridge. Now, his mother was already a Christian, right? So he had that influence in his life. At this point in time, though, there's only 2% of the empire is Christian. So he wasn't saying like, oh my gosh, I'm going to throw some power behind this growing group. So to pick something that small, he had to have some belief in it, right? Like to pick a group that essentially to a lot of people would be like, we're pagans. Why are you picking that? And only 2% of the empire believes it. So I do think he had to have some sort of a buy-in into it himself. Now, earlier in his career, um, he's into this other deity called Sol Invictus, or the unconquerable sun. So if you kind of compare Sol Invictus to what we would see as Jesus, like they're quite similar. So I think for him it wasn't a leap of faith to kind of jump from one to the other, because he's like, all right, well, okay, so maybe this is more true, right? Because I've had this vision and I've won this thing. So I think he had to have some buy-in into it. I don't think he was just like, I'm going to go fool everybody. I don't see it as that way.
So he thought maybe that Jesus was the unconquerable sun, or
Yeah, you have to look at it that way too. Like, have you ever watched Zeitgeist or read
yeah.
So like so much of our like how we talk about religion is very similar, right? Because as people we have similar experiences and cultures that aren't connected. So I think a lot of times we're going towards similar things, but maybe we don't know what to call them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I think Constantine was purported to have seen a vision in the sun or in the sky, and that's when
Yes.
he saw. Did he see the cross or did he see
The
Jesus?
Cairo, which is the symbol of like the P and X in front of each other. They're Greek letters, Chi and Rho.
Oh, and that was the first Christian symbology.
Yeah, and he hears the words like, "Under this sign you will conquer." So they paint the Cairo on all the Roman shields.
You were saying that there was two sects, or at least two powerful, as you said, the Arians and the Orthodoxy. What are the differences of those? Or at the time, what were they?
So it was about the divine nature of Jesus. Like you have this idea of like, okay, the Trinity, right? Is Jesus fully God and fully man, or is he just a man and a son of God? So like they're trying to figure out like, what does it mean? Now, where we arrive from there is you have the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit that are all of the same essence, and they are God in just different forms of God, is what we arrive at in there. The Arians thought that these were different parts of the same being, if that makes sense,
That
or different like people, right? But they were kind of associated in that way.
so they thought that the sun was different than
Did you
explain
freeze
that
again?
exactly. What's that? I'm still here, but you are choppy. I don't
Oh,
know
did
what
you
the audience
freeze?
No, I didn't freeze.
Oh,
Can you hear me
I
still?
froze. Sorry, man.
Yeah, your thing got choppy for a moment, but I can still hear you and see you, and it's beautiful. So you said the Aryans thought that. So what was different exactly? What pieces were different?
So you have to the Trinity in a Catholic viewpoint, Catholic meaning universal, um, is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are of the same essence, right? Like they're three persons, but they're all of the same essence. But when you look at it through Arians, the Arians said, well, they aren't of the same essence. They're different beings, but they're all kind of they're all God in a different way. Whereas, do you get what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
it's hard to explain the differentiation because it's actually it's a very minute point, but it became a very big point for these two groups.
So then Constantine calls this Council of Nicaea, which is one. Wasn't the first council as far as I know, but it was one of many councils where they would bring bishops from all across the land that had their
Yeah,
local belief structures and writings. And then
which is
what happened?
interesting because a lot of the verbiage that's used is actually so. In 284, Emperor Diocletian takes this empire that's kind of failing, and he does all these like reforms. Like he reforms the money, he reforms the military, he also reforms how it's organized, and he creates this thing called the Tetrarchy or Rule of Four. There's a senior emperor in the West and a senior emperor in the East, and a junior emperor in the West and a junior emperor in the East. So there's these four guys in charge. Now they all rule as one, and he was the one in charge of all of them, but there's four guys essentially in charge because this is a big thing. But if you look at a lot of the units of like what things were called when he reorganizes things, all these words are what are used in the Catholic Church, like a diocese, like the I'm trying to remember some of the different ones. Like if you look at the organizing words that are used, they come from Diocletian's actual reorganizing is actually where the verbiage comes from, which I guess is a funny reversal because Diocletian was he was rough on Christians because during that point in time, like you have all these problems, right? And people are culturally we were different too. So whenever that happened, Roman emperors thought a way to get along culturally is, well, let's persecute the Christians because at least we're all united against this group. So the Christians actually end up using the verbiage that he uses to reorganize the empire and actually how the church is structured.
Is that because they
Like
were
a vicar is another word that would have been used by Diocletian.
a vicar? They
A vicar meaning like someone in charge of an area of
like
like
a
a church.
like a
Yeah, like
viceroy?
a parish, a vicar, a diocese. These are all words that were used in the reorganization by Diocletian.
Is it because people that formed the early Catholic Church were actually Roman plants, and they were like, let's empower the memory of Diocletian
I don't
by.
think so. I think it's more of like they saw it as effective and they would have understood what these words meant, so they just kind of used them.
Yeah, like I always thought it was interesting how Kennedy was assassinated and then immediately put on the silver dollar like the next year in 1964. And like, who did all that? I don't know.
Wasn't he talking about putting us on a silver standard too, which would be wild?
Oh, that's wild. I don't, that's amazing. Interesting. So at the Council of Nicaea, I was just kind of course corrected
Yeah.
on this X space about because I thought what
Yeah,
happened was
like I said, I'm totally open to correction too because I don't know everything about everything.
okay,
So
good. Yeah,
thank
let's
you
figure.
whoever said that.
Yeah, they go. I thought they went to the Council of Nicaea, and at the council they were like, let's remove all these things and just we're left with this stuff. But apparently not. Are you like an expert on these councils? Do you know exactly what was going on?
I'm not. I'm definitely not an expert in the councils. So like I said, I know kind of how some of the early organization happens. Like they decide on a date for Easter. They take a look at Arianism. Um, are they talking about like icons? Because icons are bigger in the Eastern Church than the Western Church. Is that what they're referring to?
I don't know, but why is that?
Because they didn't want people to like worship an icon. They wanted people to worship God. And, people during that point in time, because once again, we're pagans becoming Christians, a lot of times they were worshiping, these different like, these different like ways of portraying a deity. So it was something that they didn't want people worshiping things that are here. We want people worshiping God, which
But
that makes sense, I think, right?
in the yeah, I think the concept does. In the Eastern Empire, though, is that where the orthodoxy is created? And is that like was that the orthodox? I know the Byzantine Empire has this purple cross with like a diagonal line through it. Is
Well,
there?
there's a schism in like I think it's 1050 or something like that between East and West. Once again, I don't know all these dates from memory, but I think it's in like 1050 or something like that. There's a split between East and West, and that's where you get kind of your Orthodoxy versus Catholicism
Is that
and you have the in Constantinople becomes the center of that Constantinople, which is now Istanbul.
that's is that what the diagonal line through the cross means? It's a schism.
I don't know. I don't know as much about the Eastern Church.
Well, so why did the Eastern visit the Eastern Roman Empire adopt iconoclasty? Is that what it's called? Icon.
Just
But
icons.
why did
Icons are
they
just
do that?
portrayals.
Do you know why they relied heavier on icons?
I don't know. I just know it's culturally like something they did.
They were just okay with it. Yeah, certain religions seem to be more
It's
okay.
it's I'm diving a lot into Byzantium now. I don't know as much about Byzantium. I'm reading
Oh,
doing a couple cool books on it right now. I'm actually doing a great course on it. I can send you the link if you're interested. But on Byzantium, because the thing that's interesting about Byzantium too is they wouldn't have called themselves Byzantines. That word was used way after to describe them. They called themselves Romans because they saw themselves as being the continuation of the Roman Empire.
what when you like looking back on the Romans now, what do you have? What is your I guess what is your favorite aspect of it, or do you have an area where you're like, God, this is just so interesting?
Um, hmm. Like, I think the way they use propaganda is really interesting, and I think, so that's actually what my grad thesis is on. My grad thesis is on the propaganda that, um, Augustus used to convince people he was God, because because the thing you have to take a look at is Greeks and Romans looked at divinity in a different way. The Greeks looked at divinity like, there's gods walking around here right on earth with us, and like, hey, they may impregnate your neighbor and you may meet them one day. Whereas the Romans really saw it as there's a separation between God and ourselves. So a lot of early divinity comes from a mix of Greek culture and Eastern culture, because in Babylon, the Babylonian king was seen as a god, right? In Egypt, the pharaoh was seen as a god. So that's where Alexander the Great plays a really important part in this. So Alexander conquers Babylon and he conquers Egypt. There's this moment of him going to the oracle at Zeus Ammon. Ammon is a city in Egypt, and he's greeted as "Greetings, son of God." And he hears this, and he's like, "Son of God, that's really interesting," because the pharaoh would have been greeted as son of God, and by conquering Egypt, he's a son of God. So he had also connected himself to Heracles through his mother, Olympias, and he'd really created this idea that he was divine. So he starts carrying himself a lot more as divine. When they're in Babylon, he institutes this process called proskynesis. So proskynesis is actually where, like, it's not that you just bow before a king, but you lay your entire body on the floor in front of a king. So he starts making everybody do this. And it becomes weird to his generals. So there's this one general named Clytus the Black, and Clytus the Black was like his father, Philip II of Macedon's top general. So Clytus the Black raises a point about this. He's like, I know your dad. Like, I fought with your dad. Like, you're not the son of God. You're the son of Philip. So in a drunken rage, Alexander actually kills him in front of all his men. So that's a kind of a real breaking point, and he really changes kind of the way people look at a ruler. There's a lot of worship culture of Alexander after this point because he kind of creates that. So then I read this really interesting article. This is way back in I think 2009 in grad school, called Augustus at Actium. And it was written by this Jesuit priest named Dr. Cuthbert Leyte. And he talks about after Augustus wins the Battle of Actium, he goes to where the body of Alexander the Great was kept, and he bows before it and prays. And I'm like, that's really weird. Why is this Roman bowing and praying before the mummified body of Alexander the Great? And I took that and started looking at a lot of different things Augustus does in his career. And I think the thing, and if I'm making too big of a web here, please slow me down. Once again, I'm like super ADHD. But there's this competition for who's going to really be in charge of Rome in kind of the late empire, the late civil war between Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, who's Augustus's adopted father. And Julius Caesar tries to do it through power, and he tries to weakly connect himself to the god Venus and these different things. Pompey, he connects himself with Alexander, and he tries to portray himself as the new Alexander, right? He conquers Europe like Alexander. He conquers Asia, Africa like Alexander, which is conquering the known world at this point in time. And people loved Pompey because he gave them stuff. He built them stuff. Like, people loved Pompey. So people would follow Pompey. People feared Caesar, but people loved Pompey. So Augustus learned a lot from this. And he said, well, I'm going to position myself as the new Alexander because this is really effective for Pompey. So he starts doing that. But now one of the really important things that he does is, number one, I mentioned he commissioned a lot of the early histories because those are vital, right? Like, people have to look at things a certain way and understand, like, hey, you're here. He also creates the statues of himself and places them all over the empire. And even in his elder years, he never looks older than 30 in any of these statues because he wants people to see him as young and vibrant and, godlike. He creates a worship cult to Julius Caesar because, okay, well, if Julius Caesar's a god, then Augustus must be a god. So he creates a lot of these early steps that create king worship. Now, we don't have actual real king worship until 250 under Decius. But I think a lot of the early steps and a lot of the way people look at the emperor were started under Augustus. So to me, that's the most interesting time period.
What happened with Decius that people saw him as a god?
He made a law that people had to offer sacrifices to him on his birthday every year.
Did that prolong then for generations after him?
Well, that's 250, and then we have the changes under Diocletian that happened in 284, and then Rome becomes a Christian empire in thought around 300 with Constantine, and it becomes a Christian empire actually in the 370s under anyway, I think it was becomes and Theodosius, there we go, in that time period. So it lasts for quite a bit, right? But that's one of the major issues is caused by Christianity in that time period because Christians, and this is what we're talking about in the space, like Christians and Romans didn't look at religion the same way. Romans thought that this is a group thing that we do together and what the state does, whereas Christians look at religion as a very individual thing. So when they say, hey, you have to offer sacrifice to the emperor, Romans saw Christians not doing it as a political act, whereas Christians saw it as a religious act. And that's one of the major things that causes some of the biggest persecutions of Christians after that point in time.
And did Constantine, was he expecting people to make sacrifices to him on his birthday?
I don't have the answer to that. Because I know things were changing rapidly during Constantine's rule, and he doesn't actually become a Christian until his deathbed. But there are still a lot of pagan symbols that he uses. So he's following a lot of Christian ideas, but he's not exactly ruling as a Christian emperor. But we have this big transition during his rule.
So Augustus, so Julius Caesar in no way intimated that he was a god to the people. He was just a dude.
And he tried to tie himself to Romans would do this. They would say oh, I'm related to the goddess Venus or things like that. But I really don't think people believed it,
Okay. But then Augustus came in. He was like, no, actually, literally he was a god
Yeah, because there's after Caesar dies, there's this comet that comes across the sky, and he calls everyone's attention to the comet. And he goes, "Look, it's my father going to heaven." And he tries to like putting himself in the heavens, and that's an idea that he's then deified because the deified Julius.
Did he believe it, or was he just a master manipulator?
I think he was like, once again, we don't have firsthand what he thought about this. We have a book that he wrote called My Deeds, but we don't have like his thoughts on it. Like he just talks about Caesar did this and Caesar did that and Caesar did this, like, but we don't have his like thoughts about things.
Like my struggle, my deeds sounds kind of like Mein Kampf. That's wild. So
It's called the Way of the Divine Augustus, I believe, is the actual name of it.
he wrote it.
Somebody probably wrote it for him. And he probably dictated it to him.
Okay. Yeah, I heard Caesar was like the ultimate dictator. Like he could sit with funny word dictator. Like he would sit in his carriage and he'd have like 4 secretaries and he'd be telling one secretary about a battle. And then as she starts to write what he said, he'd go to the next person and tell them about the economic strategy. And as they start to write, he goes to the next guy and tells them about the next political move on Thursday. And then the next guy, and then he's back to the first one, like continuing the battle strategy when she's done writing, and he goes to the next guy. And he was just like, he was just such an incredible organizer mentally.
Well, he was a really smart guy too, but like I think the thing that's interesting about him is Julius Caesar doesn't happen if it's not for this guy named Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was he was I believe a praetor, which was a Roman office under General Gaius Marius, who was a consul. And Gaius Marius is like this big reformer of the Roman army. Like Rome doesn't have a standing army until Gaius Marius comes. He's also the guy, like when you think of the Roman standard, like that golden eagle, Gaius Marius is actually the one that creates the Roman standard just because he liked eagles. And that's where that comes from. So there's going after different barbarian tribes, and Sulla has a major victory, which do you know what a Roman triumph is? Like a parade?
Yeah, it's when they would bring them back to the city and parade them through
Yeah.
the city after like a campaign, a successful campaign.
Yeah, so Sulla, who's working under Marius, has this major victory, and they win the battle because of Sulla. But then a triumph is given to Marius. So Sulla sees this as a slight, and it starts a civil war between these two guys. And you weren't supposed to bring troops under arms into the city of Rome. And so they'd both done that. Marius brings troops into Rome and says, I'm in charge, and he gives himself 7 consulships because of that. You're never supposed to have more than 2. Sulla then brings troops into Rome and conquers it. And the thing that actually stops the civil war between them is Marius just doesn't wake up one day. He just gets really old and dies. And Sulla starts this thing called proscriptions. So proscriptions were basically they would write all these people's names on a tablet and keep it by the forum, and they would just be killing anybody that opposed Sulla on a daily basis. So he's the person that really shakes what's left of this republic, right? Because Rome had been through almost 100 years of civil war by the time we get to Sulla, and he creates the instability that Caesar then walks into, because Caesar is empowered by another Roman government official to actually be the opposition to Sulla, like the balancing point against Sulla. And that's where all this money and power is flowed to Caesar, because they say, okay, well, we're going to empower this guy because that guy's even worse. And that's how we get Caesar.
Was when Caesar, then he marched in, was it like just one day finally the shit hit the fan and he marches all these dudes into the city, and does he kill Sulla? Is Sulla still there ruling at the time?
No, Sulla was actually, he dies outside of Rome because he's eventually kicked out of Rome. And the Senate and the regular offices establish a little bit of stability. But then Caesar, after this time period, he declares himself dictator. Then he's out kind of fighting. Then he declares himself dictator for life. Then the Senate calls him back because they basically want to try him for being in power too long. And that's where the whole idea of crossing the Rubicon comes from. He crosses this little small river. We actually don't even really know where it is to this day, but there's thoughts and ideas of where it may be, outside of Rome. He crosses this river with his troops under arm. And once again, you're not supposed to bring armed troops into Rome, and puts himself in charge. And that's kind of they created their own monster because they wanted stability.
Did they, when he marched across the Rubicon, did he like march into the Senate, capture and slaughter all the senators, or did he like keep them alive and was like, you serve me now?
It was more of them just being in fear of him, right? They lived in fear of Caesar. And then eventually there's this uprising in the Senate chambers, and all these guys come in and just start stabbing him to death. He's stabbed like many, 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 many times.
That's like Brutus. when he's like "Et tu, Brute." That's the from
Yeah,
like
and the Brutus,
the
the
Shakespeare
Brutus,
play.
yeah, the Brutus family has like an interesting, like he probably never said "et tu, Brute." That's a Shakespeareization of things. Shakespeare's fun though, right?
Yeah.
But like if the Brutus family is really interesting because the Brutus family is seen as kind of the slayer of kings, because Rome really didn't like kings. It was really seen in poor taste to have a king. So you have the seven traditional kings of Rome, the last being Tarquin the Proud. Tarquin the Proud is killed by a guy named Brutus. So then you have Caesar also killed by a guy named Brutus. So like I said, we don't know, did the kings of Rome exist? Well, if you tie him to Brutus, right, then you could have him be, they might have made up Tarquin the Proud and said that Brutus killed him. You get what I'm saying? To like
Yeah.
say that he killed a king, we killed a king. So that's why even when Augustus becomes, the guy in charge after Actium in 31 BC, he calls himself the princeps, or the first citizen, right? He doesn't call himself a king. The Senate is still there. A lot of the offices are still there, but now you have the Senate and the first citizen. And he even says after a certain point, like, once again, this is a awesome play on reverse psychology on people, because they've been through 100 years of civil war. And he says, okay, everything's safe right now. I'm going to lay down my power. And they're like, no, 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 no. You need to stay here. You need to stay here. You need to be in charge. And that's the Senate after that gives him the title Augustus. So that's where he becomes emperor, but he's not really an emperor because they don't like the idea of kingship. So he calls himself the princeps, or the first citizen.
Was he just like super, super smart and was like really legitimately establishing order and calming people down with like tactics and stuff?
Yeah, he was brilliant. He was a brilliant tactician, and he comes to power like, not as first citizen, but like he gets his first military leadership at 19. So like the guy was like, like similar to Alexander the Great. Alexander gets his first military leadership at 18. Like these guys were brilliant at a young age.
And he was raised by Julius Caesar. He was
No,
Julius Caesar's adopted son.
no. So the
Oh,
way,
this is Augustus.
so you have to understand adoption in the ancient world. Adoption in the ancient world, like you could give somebody your name and titles and all of your stuff, and that was called adoption. So his name before that is Gaius Octavius. Octavius is another family, but Julius Caesar in his will gives him the name Caesar, right? So that's where you have this whole back and forth between Octavius and also Mark Antony, because Mark Antony was one of Julius Caesar's top generals. So he expected, okay, Caesar's dead, I'm going to be the guy in charge. And then you find out in Caesar's will, okay, well, Caesar just adopted Gaius Octavius. So now he's Gaius Octavius Caesar.
And that's because Caesar was all about meritocracy. And he's like, yo, Gaius is just better than you, Mark. Sorry. Mark was
I
like,
don't
you
know about
kidding?
that. I think he just still wanted to make sure that, like, even though in death, he wanted to maintain control.
Oh, and he thought that this Gaius Octavius was going to be the guy that could do it, and that
Yeah.
Mark Antony was not
And
capable.
it's Mark Antony too. Like Caesar and Antony, by the end of Caesar's career, didn't really get along great. Early in his career, he was always his top guy.
And then so I want to talk about the whatever it was, these three guys. It was, I think,
Triumvirate?
the triumvirate. Was it Pompey, Crassus, and Mark Antony? Was it the three of those guys? Pompey, Crassus, and another guy. And they kind of rose
two
up.
triumvirates. There's Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, and then the one later on is Augustus, Mark Antony, and then I forget who the third one is.
Okay, that's not what I was thinking of. I know that.
Okay.
So Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar kind of ruled the nation de facto because they were the richest man, the two richest men, and the greatest warrior or something. So they all
Because the Republic was breaking down at that point. So like typically you would have your two consuls, which were in charge of the army, but you would also have these guys tribunes. And tribunes are really hard to explain because they did a lot of different things, but they also did nothing. So they were kind of like they were the two highest political offices.
Okay.
Whereas consuls are more like military political offices.
So Caesar was a consul, and then Pompey and Crassus were tribunes. Is that what you called them? Or,
they'd all held those offices at different points in their life.
Okay.
What would happen is there's basically a scale of different offices you could go through. It's similar to like you had to be this age to hold a praetor. You had to be this age to hold a different one.
And then the top office was
consul. And then a lot of times you go from there, you go from the Senate or something like that to the Senate or something like that.
One of the things about Alexander the Great was he was sent by Philip, his father, to be educated by Aristotle, one of Plato's students, and so it was this brilliant teacher that Philip or that Alexander had from a young age. Did the first emperor Augustus, did he have a brilliant teacher of note that he studied under?
I don't know that he had a brilliant teacher. Like I said, he had a lot of scribes that wrote things for him, but we don't really know as much about Augustus's education.
He might have just been a genius, like just a
It's like
savant.
they probably would have had like a Greek household slave or something that would have educated him.
Okay. So
And
what I was
slavery is very different in this point in time too. Like it's not like we think of like slavery in the American South. It's slavery were also often like the Romans defeated this other country in battle. We're going to use these people to do different tasks for us, and depending what their ability is, we'll either treat them well or we won't treat them well. But it's not the same as we think of like slavery from the American experience.
so some Roman slaves would actually have a higher position in society than some Roman citizens.
Yeah.
What I was asking about when I said the triumvirate, what I was thinking of is when Caesar, I don't know if you'd say he betrayed the Republic, but when he attacked the Republic and took over, the three guys rose up to fight against him, and there was like wars that persisted for a while. I think it was Pompey, Crassus, and another guy. Do you know much what I'm talking about? They're called like it starts with an O, I think.
I know what you're talking about, but it escapes me on there because then what happens is you have all the different it's the guys that are like kind of the assassins of Caesar, right? Is who they're going after, but it's Augustus that's going after them after Caesar dies.
No, I'm thinking of like the wars that took place after Caesar seized the Republic and started the first empire, Julius Caesar.
Well, he didn't start the empire.
He just took control of the Republic.
Augustus.
But then they tried to fight him, like try and resist his tyranny when he seized the Republic.
Yeah, but they eventually kill him anyway, right? Like there's no it's not really a military thing. They just kill him.
Okay. Did he hunt down like other consuls and dudes and like execute like Mark Antony?
He likely did because that's how politics worked in this time period, but we don't know as much about this as we do about like Sulla, who like literally wrote lists of people and put them out in the forum and said we're going to kill these guys. And it actually if your name was on a proscription list, murder wasn't a crime. You could just go kill them and it was cool.
So he would put a list of names, and then those people were just
and there was monetary rewards if you could bring the head.
How many people did he put bounties on like that?
Well, there would be people that would be killed and they weren't even on the list, and they would try and say, "Oh, this is the guy, right? He's on the list." You would have this happen where they would try and like get rewards and things for people that weren't on proscription lists.
If a guy killed a dude that wasn't on the proscription list, would he be tried for murder?
That I don't know. I know they would often try and position people that weren't on the prescription list as people that were because they would get money for it.
Oh my God. How long did that last?
It's like an under a year time period, and eventually it just stops. But like they don't early on, it's very upsetting to people because it's like, why are there's names on it every day? Like there's new names every day.
Do you see like, because people are like, oh, today the fall of the American Empire is like the fall of the or the fall of the American Republic is like the fall of the Roman Republic. Do you see like warning signs in modern society that we can avoid based on your studies?
Well, I think first of all, like we got to be talking on the same kind of vocabulary on it. And I think a lot of times, I think you're in agreement with me on this, but I think we ceased to be a functional republic a long time ago. So I think to say like, oh, the republic is falling, it's like, it already fell, dude. Like it fell in 1913. Like I think the progressive era was really rough on like what was left of an American republic because, we lose our sovereignty through the Federal Reserve. We lose our income through income taxes. And then we have the 17th Amendment, which takes away the ability of states to represent themselves. And if you just look at it just functionally, like, well, you're now becoming a direct democracy, right? Because the Senate and the House are voted for the exact same way. So you're not really a functional republic anymore. So if you're looking at it, Wilson is more of your like Caesar character, like the guy that ends the previous thing. Whereas somebody like FDR is more like your Augustus, the guy that creates the new thing, right? And FDR is interesting, right? Because like he keeps getting elected and he dies in office, right? Like there's a good chance people would have elected him again, like if he lived. So I think it's really interesting when you look at it that way. He's the closest thing we've ever had to an American king. And the what's left of the republic, right? A lot of the vestiges are there, right? A lot of the same things are there, but we don't function the same way. So I look at it more as like a late stage empire thing than a late stage republic thing.
That's interesting because FDR carried the Roosevelt name. his grandfather was also a president, Teddy Roosevelt. So he had that like royalty lineage. And he also kind of portrayed that he was healthy when he was crippled, like he had
Yeah.
lost the ability to walk, but they just kept showing
Propaganda's
him.
fun, man.
Yeah.
Right, and it's like history is not an exact repeating thing, but it's like there are a lot of things that can be similar throughout history, right? Because even if you look at it, like I know you and I on the culture war episode we did, we talked about like the crisis of the third century, and the major things happening there were you had a central power issue, which our 10th Amendment fixes that because the tetrarchy that Diocletian creates is similar to what the 10th Amendment does. Like you have places in charge of different areas. But inflation and immigration are big problems. And those were two of the major problems they were dealing with. They had 15,000% inflation. Immigration, you had all these barbarians just coming across into the Roman provinces. And after 212, they'd all been given citizenship by Caracalla. So we have a lot of that. We don't have the exact same problems, but we have very similar problems. And I think those are, if you look at citizenship and the economy, right? Like if we don't get back on some sort of gold standard or something, I don't know if it's XRP. I don't know what it is, but we need some sort of a standard because the immigration and a monetary policy will destroy a country or destroy an empire.
What happened to the Romans that they suffered 15,000%? Is that what you said? Inflation? What
Yes.
happened? And over
So
what extended period of time?
so we're looking at like around 193 AD to around 284. So it's a like almost a 100-year period. But there's these guys, and 193 is when Commodus dies. Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius. And what happens is you have the rise of what are called Baric emperors, the first of these being Septimius Severus. And what they would do is they would pay a military. Then their military would say, hey, we have the biggest military. Our guy is now emperor. So you have like 47 different guys in this time period claim to be emperor over this less than 100-year time period. So what would happen is they would debase the currency to pay the military because that's where their power came from. So they would add different metals to it. They would clip coins. They would do whatever they had to do to pay the military. And that's what absolutely destroys it because you now have them paying the military as they're having these internal civil wars. Well, you have a break off empire. Part of the Roman Empire in the West breaks off and calls itself the Gallic Empire. You have part of the empire breaks itself off in the East and becomes another empire. So the Roman Empire is breaking down and the tax base is getting destroyed. So you're, inflating the money, you're losing the tax base, and what is that going to create? Massive inflation because you have to create more money with less money coming in.
Yeah, I'm really am concerned about mercenary warfare in general that you could pay to play with. I mean, I think it's one of the glories of a governmental standing army, and as corrupt as it can be, like, dear God, at least it's not pay to win. Like,
Yeah. Well, in the late empire too, like one of the problems you have as well is eventually the Roman army, it's from the late Republic to the late 5th century or early 5th century, it's almost doubled in size, right? Like this military is almost doubled in size and you're having to pay for it. But also there's more what we consider barbarians than Romans in this army. So now like culturally you're losing the culture. And eventually when the money dries up, who are they going to follow, right? Like they don't need the Romans anymore. And that's what eventually happens in 476 is this barbarian general Odoacer, who had been running the final emperor Romulus Augustulus, is basically the guy in charge of him anyway, says, okay, I'm going to give you this nice place to go live. I'm going to give you some money every year until you die. And I'm the king now. And that's how the empire falls. It's not this like it's burning and people are running in the streets. That's once again how Justinian wrote about it because he looked bad otherwise.
Odoacer. I think I used to call him Oda Whacker, but that's kind of fun. Oh, look, we got some super chats I want to pull up. Philip Fisher with the let's go. Thanks, Philip. You too, Philip Fisher. Oh, Philip coming in again hot. I lived in southern France in Carcassonne. The history of the Cathars was super cool. I went to a lot of their historical sites. I'm fascinated with like Catholic heresy in general. There's other ones too. There was the, oh geez, you probably know better than I do. There's the Cathar. There was what was it called? It starts with an L. Oh, geez. I'm not going to be able to come up with these off the top of my head right now. But anyway.
I'm one of those weird people, Ian, that like, I know I win Jeopardy in the privacy of my own home because I know a little bit about a lot of things.
Yeah. And then when people ask you specific questions, it's kind of like throwing darts at a dartboard.
Well, yeah, it's like I've read so much, so it's like certain things I've dove a lot into, and that's why I know a lot more about certain time periods. But like I know a lot of things to be able to put history together and kind of like I don't know, see the same things happen again.
Dude, former power lifter Jeremy Ryan Slate. It's about 2 p.m. Brother, nice biceps, by the way. I wanted to, first of all, thank you for coming.
Yeah,
We're going to
man.
do this again next Friday on your channel.
Yeah.
At 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Yes, sir.
I'm looking forward to that. So I'll be posting that link on Twitter, on X, on my account when we're about to go live. But remember, 4 o'clock next Friday, me and Jeremy on Jeremy's channel on YouTube and wherever else you're gonna post.
Yeah, we're gonna do YouTube. We'll be on X, so we're gonna have a good time, man.
And check the description to the video, at least on the YouTube and wherever you can, to get all the links to Jeremy's stuff. Great, super cool guy. Obviously, you know that. I don't have to tell you. But dude, thanks again, man.
Yeah, man. And to all our historians out there, like once again, I said, I'm always trying to do my best. I do make mistakes. I'm not infallible, but I do appreciate you guys hanging out today.
So if anyone wants to send you corrections, do you have a good place for them to contact you?
Hit me up on X. I'm glad to have the conversation. As I said, I'm not right about everything, but I'm trying to do my best to put history together so we don't make the same mistakes.
X, thank you. All right, everyone, to you watching, subscribe to the channel, follow me all over the platforms, follow Jeremy all over everywhere, and we'll see you again next time. Bye.